They didn't hang her. They didn't whip her. They branded her, not with iron, but with silence, shame, and the wide-open stares of a dusty mercantile in a town that believes a man leaving is always the woman's fault. Her name is Nita, Apache, widow, 3 sons clinging to her skirts like ghosts with ribs. She doesn't raise her voice. She raises her chin. And across the street, a cowboy watches, a ghost in his own right, and he feels something in his chest crack open. The wind had teeth that day, scraping down the windows of Barlow's mercantile like claws. Inside, the air wasn't much kinder. Nita stood at the counter, spine straight, hand trembling as she laid 2 thin coins on the scarred pine. "I need flour and salt, Mr. Barlow, on credit," she said quietly. "Half now, the rest after harvest." Barlow's arms crossed. His voice, though, was a thunderclap, meant not just for her, but for every mouth-breather pretending to read labels behind her. "We don't run tabs for women who can't hold on to a husband," he said, each word sharpened by scorn. "This town has standards." The store didn't go quiet. It turned hollow. The kind of silence that swallows dignity. Behind her, Nita felt her 3 boys press closer. Caleb stiffened like a pine rail. Levi stared hard at the worn floorboards. And little Cody, only 4, clutched her skirt with both hands. "Please," Nita said, voice barely audible. "They're hungry." Barlow didn't even bother looking at them. "Maybe if you'd been a proper wife, Mitch wouldn't have run off. Now move along." The heat that flared in Nita's cheeks was shame, rage, and heartbreak, all tangled up like thorns. She gathered her sons with slow, mechanical grace. As she turned, a woman's whisper sliced through the air behind her, sharp and deliberate. "Shameless creature." That's when Cody's voice cracked the spell. "Mama, are we bad?" Nita didn't answer. Her boots hit the porch boards like the end of a prayer. Across the street she saw him, a man half shadow, half smoke, Silas, cowboy, drifter, damaged, leaning on a hitching post like he'd grown roots and lost the will to pull them up. He didn't speak, didn't blink, but he saw everything. He saw the pride in Nita's walk even as her heart bled out beneath her worn dress. He saw the boys, thin, silent, loyal, and something inside him, cold for 3 winters now, shifted. His jaw clenched, his hands curled at his sides. But he didn't move. Not yet. That night, Silas sat astride his horse on the ridge above her claim. The moon poured silver over a scene more haunting than any graveyard. Nita, her braid wind-whipped, swung an axe like a woman who'd never held one. Her boys huddled near a feeble fire pit, smoke and sparks rising into the black. No chimney, no real walls, just canvas scraps, warped boards, and prayers too old to answer. Caleb helped where he could, silent and serious. Levi wrapped his arms around Cody, who whimpered quietly, not for attention, but because his belly was a hollow drum. Silas watched, and remembered. Abigail. Rose. A wife and daughter buried by blizzard and fever while he was chasing a paycheck 2 towns away. When he came back, they were cold. Gone. And so was he, in all but body. But tonight, something changed. He turned his horse toward town. Barlow's shop was locked, but Silas knew the hiding spot for the spare key. He didn't hesitate. He broke in, left a stack of silver, more than enough. Then loaded sacks, flour, salt, dried meat, nails, heavy canvas. By the time the horizon hinted at dawn, Silas was back at her doorstep. He set the goods down without a note, without a name, then vanished into the morning mist. When the sun cracked the sky, Nita stepped outside to gather kindling. She froze. The supplies were there. Real. Heavy. Hope and fear clashed in her chest like dueling horses. "Boys," she called. They came running. Levi touched the flour sack like it was a miracle. Caleb stayed guarded, arms crossed. Cody beamed. "Who brought it, Mama?" Levi asked. "I don't know," she whispered. "But we'll earn it back." Far down the road, a rider approached. Not the cowboy, but Preacher Shaw, his face grim. "Storm's coming. 2 days, tops. Worst I've seen in years." Then he was gone. Nita looked at the lean-to, then at the sky. She was out of time. If this story stirred something in you, if you felt the snow, the shame, the strength of a mother and a cowboy's breaking heart, then subscribe. We've got more coming. And out here, every choice counts. The storm hadn't come yet, but Silas couldn't sleep. He sat by his small campfire miles from town, turning a horseshoe in his hands like it held answers. But there was no fixing what time had already twisted. Abigail's face flickered in the firelight, her voice long gone. Rose's laugh echoed faint, like wind through dead grass. But now there was her, Nita Hale, Apache widow, 3 sons with ribs too close to their skin and eyes too old for their years. That moment in the mercantile, the way she stood tall in her disgrace, he'd seen death with kinder hands. Silas stood, kicked dirt over the flames and saddled up. By midnight, he was back at the edge of her claim. The lean-to was barely holding shape in the wind. Canvas flapped like a wounded bird. Inside, a weak fire coughed smoke. Her oldest boy, Caleb, kept watch near the woodpile, arms folded, jaw set like he was twice his age. Silas stayed hidden in the dark, watching. That's what I was meant to do, he thought. Not sleep, not forget, not move on. Watch, witness, and pay. But that night, something snapped. He turned his horse and rode like a man chased by fire. Barlow's mercantile was dark, but he knew where the key was stashed. Same place it had been since he'd first bought nails here 10 years ago. Silas didn't flinch as he pried the door open. He knew what he was about to do, and he did it anyway. He left a stack of silver on the counter, more than he'd made in 2 months. He didn't steal. He settled a debt. Flour, salt, cured bacon, dried apples, 2 blankets, a hammer, a sack of nails, heavy canvas, a spool of twine, and a hand axe that looked too new for the dust it sat in. He loaded it all into burlap sacks, strapped them to his saddle, and rode out under a sky split by stars. When he reached her ridge, the first blush of dawn was just touching the hills. Nita's claim looked more like a warning than a home. Bare earth, wind-torn canvas, and a woman doing her damnedest not to fall apart. He set the supplies down gently by the door. No note, no voice, just action. Then he rode away like a ghost before the sun could name him. Nita rose early. The kind of early born from fear, not habit. She stepped outside with her kindling basket, but her eyes locked on the sacks like they were a hallucination. For a moment, she just stared. Then her hand went to her mouth, trembling. "Boys," she called out. Her voice cracked. "Come see?" They came running barefoot through the frost-bitten dirt. Caleb didn't smile. He scanned the tree line like a soldier. Levi reached out, hesitant, and brushed his fingers over the flour sack. Cody laughed, pure and bright, as he tried to drag the canvas bundle inside. "Mama, who brought this?" Levi asked. Nita didn't answer at first. Then, quietly, "We'll find a way to repay it, somehow." That night they ate like royalty, salt meat fried with cornmeal, and apple slices warmed by the fire. Nita said grace with tears in her eyes. Then came the knock. Silas, He stood with his hat in hand, wind-burnt face lowered. "Storm's coming," he said, voice quiet. "You're gonna need help." Nita looked at him, into him. Not a word of gratitude passed between them. Just truth. "You gonna stay? For a while?" She nodded. "Then we better brace the west wall first." That was it. No contracts, no speeches, just a shared task before the sky fell. As the wind picked up, Silas worked like a man on fire. He reinforced beams, nailed down the canvas, and tied twine across open gaps to break the gusts. Nita boiled water and passed him tools. The boys stayed close, watching him move like they didn't quite know whether to trust what they were seeing. By nightfall, snow came sideways. The lean-to groaned under the weight of wind and ice. But inside, lantern light flickered, and warmth held. Barely. Caleb watched Silas with eyes full of quiet testing. Levi handed him tools without being asked. Cody, wide-eyed and exhausted, crawled across the dirt floor and curled up against Silas's leg without a word. Silas froze, then lowered his hand gently onto the boy's back. Nita saw it. "You had children," she said softly. Silas stared into the lantern light. "Had a daughter. Rose. She'd be Cody's age now?" "Near enough," he said. His voice was low gravel. "I wasn't there when the fever took her. I was driving cattle, chasing pay. Came back too late." Nita didn't speak, just let the silence honor what couldn't be undone. After a long moment, he added, "Helping you, it ain't charity. It's a kind of penance." She looked at him. Really looked. The burden, the cracks, the weight he carried like an old saddle. "You think it makes it right?" "No," he said. "But it's something." They didn't sleep much that night. The wind tore like claws, but the roof held. And so did they. Morning came slow and heavy, as if the sky itself was bracing for what lay ahead. The storm had spent itself sometime before dawn, leaving behind a hush that blanketed the land in stillness. Snow coated everything in white, not the clean kind, more like ash after a burn. It felt temporary, like a breath held too long. Inside the lean-to, Nita stirred first. Her bones ached from the cold and from sleeping upright, her back pressed to the wall, one arm cradled protectively around Cody. The boy still slept, curled like a pup, a soft snore barely audible beneath the blanket. She looked over and saw Silas sitting upright, eyes open, jaw tight. He hadn't slept. He just watched, always watching. "Coffee?" she asked, voice barely a whisper. "I'd sell my boots for a cup," he said, managing a small smile. Nita chuckled softly, stood, and lit the tiny tin stove. The scent of beans and burnt grounds soon filled the air, enough to rouse the boys. Levi groaned and pulled the covers over his face. Caleb stretched, already alert, scanning the corners like a soldier checking the perimeter. He didn't trust peace. Not yet. They ate sparingly, just enough to warm their bellies. No one said much. That's how mornings went when survival sat heavy on your shoulders. Then they heard it. Hoofbeats, not galloping. Steady. Unrushed. Silas moved first, stepping outside into the glare of snowlight. Nita followed, shielding her eyes with one hand. A rider approached, a black silhouette framed against the low sky. Long coat, broad hat, horse plodding like it carried bad news. It was Preacher Shaw. He reined in a few yards out, dismounted slow, and nodded. "Mornin', Miss Nita. Mister," he added, tipping his hat toward Silas. "What brings you out this far?" Silas asked, his voice cautious. Shaw didn't waste time. He turned toward the horizon and squinted. "That sky," he said. "It ain't bruised for show. There's another storm brewin'. And it's the mean kind. Meaner than what just passed." Nita swallowed hard. "How long?" "Day and a half, maybe 2, Shaw said. "Then it's gonna come down hard. Wind, ice, maybe sleet. It'll bite through anything that ain't nailed tight." Silas stared off at the sky, lips pressed into a flat line. Nita felt the world tilt again under her feet. They'd barely made it through the last one. They wouldn't survive another. Not with canvas and prayer holding the place together. "You need to get to town," Shaw said, soft but firm. Nita shook her head. "They won't have us." "Then find a neighbor, a barn, anything," the preacher insisted. "There's nowhere," Nita said flatly. "This claim's all we've got." Shaw sighed. He looked at her boys, faces peeking through the lean-to flap. "I'll pray for you," he said finally. "We'll take that," Silas said, then added, "But we'll need more than prayer." Shaw nodded once, solemn, and mounted up. "You always did walk into storms, Silas. I hope this time you don't get buried." Then he rode off into the cold. The silence that followed hit harder than the wind. Inside, Nita sat with her head bowed, rubbing her hands together like she could scrub off the fear. Silas paced in the snow, measuring the cabin to be with his eyes. "This place ain't gonna hold," he muttered. "No," she said. "It won't." "Then we build faster." "With what? We're out of timber, Silas." "Then we get timber." She stared at him. "You gonna drag trees back on your back?" He didn't answer, just grabbed the hatchet and started toward the tree line. They worked like the devil was behind them. Silas felled 2 saplings before noon, cut them down to beam length. Caleb, without being asked, started hauling limbs and clearing snow. Levi boiled water. Nita began stitching old blankets into makeshift insulation panels. Even little Cody helped pack snow around the base of the lean-to keep the wind from sneaking under. It wasn't much, but it was something. That night, the fire burned hotter. Not from more wood, but from effort, from shared sweat, from the feeling, quiet and stubborn, that maybe they weren't as helpless as the world had told them. Still, doubt crept in like frost. "Even if we make it through this," Nita said, low so the boys couldn't hear, "they'll come for us. Folks like Barlow, like the council, Elias Thorne. This land ain't safe." Silas looked at her. His eyes weren't empty like before. They were full of fight. "Then let 'em come," he said. "They'll find out we don't scare easy." Nita smiled, a tired, crooked thing, but it held. Outside, the wind began to rise again. But inside, for the first time in years, there was warmth that came from more than fire. By dusk, the sky had turned the color of an old bruise, deep blue rimmed in iron. Snow hadn't started yet, but the wind told its own kind of truth. It moaned through the trees like a warning, rattling the lean-to walls, licking the canvas seams like a wolf testing the fence. Inside, the little fire cracked and popped, but it couldn't quite chase the chill. The boys were bundled up, shoulder to shoulder, sharing heat the way pups do when the mother ain't close enough. Nita stirred a pot of beans over the flame, though her mind wasn't on supper. Her fingers trembled, not from cold, but from knowing what waited out there in the dark. A storm, yes. But maybe something worse. Silas came in carrying the last bundle of chopped wood. He stomped the snow from his boots, cheeks flushed from wind, not warmth. "That's it," he said. "We've got enough to last 3, maybe 4 days, if we stretch." "We'll make it stretch," Nita said. Her voice was calm steel. She always sounded like that when she was afraid. Silas nodded, setting the wood by the fire. He looked at the boys. Levi was telling Cody a story about coyotes that wore boots. Caleb sat quiet, whittling a stick, the blade moving slow and careful, his jaw clenched like he was bracing for something to punch him. That boy had seen too much. And Silas knew why. Because men like me keep leaving. By nightfall, the wind was screaming. The lean-to groaned under the weight of the storm. Snow blew sideways in thick, slanted sheets, packing into the cracks and knotholes. Silas and Nita worked like mules, stuffing rags into the gaps, shoving crates against weak walls, banking the fire as high as they dared. They didn't talk. They didn't need to. Every glance, every nod between them carried whole conversations. When the roof rattled, Nita looked at Silas. He said nothing, just pressed his hand over the canvas like it might hold the sky back. The boys didn't cry, not even Cody. That was the worst part. They'd learned not to. At some point past midnight, after the worst of the wind had driven into howls, Nita sat back against the far wall, breathless. "I used to think the world couldn't get colder," she murmured. "Then it did." Silas didn't answer. He sat across from her, cradling Cody, who had finally collapsed into sleep against his chest. The boy's tiny fingers curled into Silas's coat, like they'd belonged there all along. Nita saw it. Her throat tightened. "You never said much about your girl," she said. Silas's eyes stayed on the flames. "Her name was Rose. She liked to sing to herself when she drew in the dirt, always barefoot. Said boots made her feel like a mule." He chuckled, a single breath, almost too soft to catch. Nita watched him a long moment. "You blame yourself?" Silas nodded once. "I was chasing money. I told myself I had to provide, but I was 2 towns away when the fever hit. Abigail tried to get her to the doctor. They never made it." His voice cracked on the last word, then steeled again. "I built that grave, but I didn't bury what I needed to. I stayed dead with him. And now?" He looked at her. Straight, unflinching. "Now I'm trying to come back to life." Just before dawn, something shifted. A soft sound, a child's breath in sleep, the creak of canvas, a hush deeper than silence. Cody, still asleep in Silas's lap, shifted and sighed. Then another sound. Different. Trust. It wasn't spoken, but it lived in the lean of the boy's head against Silas's chest. It lived in Levi's easy grin, half drowsy across the fire. It lived in Caleb finally setting down his whittling, letting his hand fall still. Nita saw it settle like dust on every heart in that room, including hers. In the storm's belly, the walls held. Barely, but something else held stronger. The thin, trembling threads of belonging. Later that morning, pale sun bled through the cracks in the canvas. The storm had passed, but the cold still bit. Silas stepped outside, breath fogging in front of him. The land looked like another planet. White, flattened, quiet, but intact. Behind him, Nita stepped out, wrapped in a blanket. Her eyes scanned the horizon, then the sky, then him. "Will you stay?" she asked. It wasn't a question meant for promises, just one meant for now. Silas didn't hesitate. "I'll stay." And this time, something in his voice said it wasn't just a mercy. It was a choice. The storm broke, but the cold stayed. Snowdrifts clung to the ridgeline like sleeping beasts, and the trees groaned under their new weight. The world outside was whitewashed, battered, and still. But inside the lean-to, something else had settled. Quiet, steady, unfamiliar. Peace. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that shouted and danced. The kind you earned by surviving something together. Silas stood at the edge of the clearing, hands on his hips, staring at the wreck of what barely passed for shelter. "We're gonna need 4 walls," he said, more to himself than anyone. Nita stepped up beside him, her arms crossed over a threadbare shawl. Her eyes were rimmed with tired, but they held steady. "You think we can manage it?" Silas gave her a long look. "Don't reckon we've got a choice." She didn't smile, but something in her posture softened. "Then we'd better start." That morning marked the first real day of building. Not surviving, not hiding, but building. They started with trees. There wasn't money for lumber, but the pines in the back ridge were strong, and Silas showed Caleb how to fell one with clean cuts. "Let the axe do the work," he said. "It's about rhythm, not strength." Caleb listened. He didn't talk much, but he watched like a hawk, mimicking the swing, the stance, even the way Silas wiped his hands on his jeans when he paused. The boy's hands blistered before noon. He didn't say a word about it. That night by the fire, Silas wrapped them in cloth strips, gently, like he was handling something sacred. Caleb looked up once, eyes questioning. But he didn't ask. He didn't have to. Silas gave a quiet nod. That was enough. Levi took to hauling water from the creek, half skating over the snowbanks with a tin pail that sloshed and spilled, but always made it home full enough. "I'm the delivery man," he grinned, puffing his chest. Cody's job was gathering kindling, and he took it seriously. Tiny arms wrapped around bundles of sticks like they were gold. He named each one like a pet. The family didn't question it. Some things didn't need explaining. Nita cooked, mended, stretched the rations. She also kept a ledger in her head. How many nails left, how much salt remained, which piece of canvas could be cut and repurposed. When Silas wasn't chopping or setting logs, he was in town bartering, selling off a few of his remaining belongings to buy oil, flour, and one small surprise for later. He didn't say much about what he gave up. Didn't have to. The man worked like he was laying penance into every board. 3 weeks passed in the rhythm of honest labor. The cabin rose 1 log at a time. Rough, uneven, not pretty, but solid. Silas notched each timber with care, teaching the boys as he went. "Don't cut corners," he told Levi one afternoon. "You cheat the wood, it comes back to bite you." "That true for people too?" Levi asked. Silas looked up from his hammer. His smile was sad, and it lingered too long. "Yeah, son, it is." One afternoon, with the roof half done and the walls standing firm, Silas rigged a rope swing from an old cottonwood. He didn't say why, just tied the knots, tested the seat, and stepped back. Cody squealed with joy and climbed right on, laughing like thunder over the hills. Levi gave him a shove. Even Caleb, the boy who rarely smiled, cracked something close to a grin. Nita watched from the cabin, her needle frozen mid-stitch. Her hands trembled, but not from cold. That night, they ate together. Salt pork, biscuits, beans. The firelight flickered on faces that hadn't looked this alive in a long while. Levi, mouth full, asked, "Silas, you ever get scared of anything?" Silas didn't answer right away. He stared into the fire, his face shadowed. "Yeah," he said. "Failin' folks that count on me." Levi nodded like that made all the sense in the world. Later, after the boys had fallen asleep in their shared blanket pile, Nita and Silas sat outside. The stars were clear. The air had that sharp bite, but neither of them moved to go in. "You know," Nita said, her voice quiet, "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop." Silas looked at her. "Ain't no shoes left, just steps to take." She nodded. "Still feels like it's all held together by thread." Silas leaned back against the wall. "Then let's braid the thread tighter." A pause. "You stayin'?" she asked, not looking at him. I already stayed, he said. Now I'm buildin'. Spring hadn't come yet, but the days were longer, and the snow wasn't sticking. The ground was still hard, but it didn't bite like it used to. You could hear water running beneath the frost in the creek, like the earth itself was waking up. The cabin stood now, 4 solid walls, a roof half done, chimney smoking on cold mornings. It leaned a little east and creaked when the wind caught it wrong, but it held. Most days, that was enough. Silas spent his mornings splitting logs, then showed Caleb how to notch and fit them. The boy caught on fast. Quiet, precise, like a craftsman in the making. Levi ran the cook fire with surprising skill, and Cody never stopped asking questions about trees, stars, horses, God, and whether beans counted as vegetables. Nita stitched new curtains from flour sacks. They were crooked. They were beautiful. Things felt possible until the vulture showed up. He came up the ridge late one morning, dressed too clean for real work, gloves with no calluses, a coat that hadn't seen dirt, a saddlebag full of intentions. Elias Thorne, land speculator, smiled with his teeth, not his eyes. Rumor had it he'd bought half of Coldwater, one bribe at a time. Nita saw him first. She stepped off the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, her shoulders set. Afternoon, Thorne said, tipping his hat like a gentleman. Heard you were building. Thought I'd ride by. Silas stepped out behind her. He didn't say a word. Just stood still, hands at his sides, close enough to the pistol on his belt to speak without talking. Thorne's smile thinned. Quite the homestead you're throwing together here. Mighty impressive for a claim with no papers. Nita stiffened, but didn't blink. We filed months ago. That right? Thorne clicked his tongue. Must have gotten lost in the shuffle. Silas finally spoke, voice low and steady. We'll refile. Oh, I'm sure you will, Thorne said, eyes still on Nita like she was a pawn he already owned. But you know how government works. Paperwork's funny. Sometimes it disappears. He let that hang. Then turned to Silas, voice syrupy smooth. You her husband? No. Silas didn't flinch. But I'm the man standing between you and her boys. A pause. The wind blew. Thorne tipped his hat again, slower this time. Just being neighborly. Then he turned and rode off, his horse silent on the frosted dirt. But the silence he left behind was loud. That night, Silas walked the perimeter after the boys fell asleep. Nita waited on the porch, arms folded tight. He's not done, she said. No. You believe he paid to have that claim buried? Silas nodded. Wouldn't be the first time he bought a law. Nita looked out over the dark fields, nothing but scrub, snow patches, and stubborn will. He wants the land? He wants control, Silas said. And you being here without a husband? You're easy pickings in his eyes. A pause. Then Nita said something that surprised even her. Well, he can go to hell. Silas smiled. Not big, but true. That's the spirit. The next morning, Silas taught Caleb how to use the level, measuring slope for the second roof beam. They worked quiet and efficient, side by side. Levy helped Nita plant onions. The ground was tough, but they made it yield. Cody chased a grasshopper through the frozen mud, laughing so loud it echoed off the canyon wall. That's when Silas knew. This wasn't just shelter anymore. It was home. And that meant it was something worth fighting for. But home doesn't mean safe. That night, he found tracks along the edge of the claim. Too neat for wolves, too wide for coyote. Boot prints, men. He came back to the cabin, quiet, and latched the door behind him. "What is it?" Nita asked. "Company," he said, "or the kind that thinks it owns the place." She didn't ask more. She just stoked the fire and checked on the boys. Outside, the wind kicked up again. But inside, the warmth was real, even if the threat was closing in. Silas left before dawn. He saddled the old bay quiet so as not to wake the boys. Nita was already at the stove, tying her braid with one hand and tending beans with the other. "You sure about this?" she asked without turning. "Can't let him keep playing games with your name," he said. "The claim's got to be legal, proper, paper in hand." "And you think Coldwater's gonna play fair?" Silas shrugged. "Fair doesn't matter, but showing up does." Nita turned then, eyes sharp. "Be careful." He didn't answer, just touched the brim of his hat and rode off, the rising sun barely a bruise on the horizon. The ride into Coldwater was long, cold, and quiet. Just Silas, the wind, and the weight in his chest. He carried a copy of the original claim. Nita's name signed clear as spring water, dates, map, all proper. It should have been enough. But men like Thorne didn't need bullets when they had paper and people in their pocket. The land office sat like a sore tooth at the edge of town. 2 stories of peeling paint and false authority. Clerk Evans was behind the desk, chewing on a toothpick like it was a badge. Silas laid the claim down. "Need this registered. Was filed before, but I believe it was misplaced." Evans glanced at it, smirked. "Don't see any record of that name. Sorry, friend." "I'm holding it in my hand." "Guess you never sent in the original. Can't file a copy." Silas leaned forward, voice flat. "How much did Thorne pay you to lose it?" Evans flushed red. "Watch your mouth, cowboy. Or what? You'll lie twice?" Before Evans could answer, the door creaked open. Elias Thorne stepped in, flanked by 2 men built like bank safes. His coat was pressed, his boots clean. "Gentlemen," he said, voice smooth as oil. "Is there a problem here?" "No problem," Evans stammered. "Just some confusion about a claim." Silas didn't turn. "No confusion. He took money to bury a filing." Thorne smiled. "That's a heavy accusation, Mr. Harkin. You got proof?" Silas didn't answer, because he didn't. Just the truth, and that didn't count for much here. Thorne walked slowly across the room, like a preacher visiting a dying man. "Here's how this goes," he said. "The Apache woman leaves. I'll even buy the lumber she used. No need for lawyers. No need for trouble." "And if she stays?" Silas asked. "Then it gets ugly. Town council's already talking. An unmarried man, living with a vulnerable woman, 3 children. Not proper. Might be cause for legal concern. Sheriff Poole's a God-fearing man. He takes morality serious." Silas stared at him. "You're gonna use decency as a weapon." Thorne didn't blink. "I'm going to use whatever wins." It was checkmate. No matter which way Silas moved, Nita would pay the price. Either he left and she lost the land, or he stayed, and they'd call her unfit, take her boys, drag her name through the gutter. He walked out of that office feeling like the ground had turned to quicksand. He found her at the mercantile. She'd come to trade eggs, had a basket in hand. But before she reached the counter, 3 church ladies blocked her path. "Jezebel," one hissed. "Living in open sin," another spat. Nita stood her ground, voice tight. "He's helping us survive." "You're mocking God's order," the first one said. That's when Caleb stepped forward. "Leave my mama alone," he said, voice shaking. The oldest woman shoved him hard. "Respect your elders, half-breed." And that's when Silas arrived. He stepped between them, his presence pulling the air from the room. "You call yourselves Christian?" he growled. "You'd rather see a woman and 3 children freeze than admit you're wrong?" The mercantile went dead quiet. Sheriff Poole appeared, hat in hand, eyes darting. "Now, Silas, let's not stir trouble. You let men like Thorne own this town," Silas said, "but I speak up and I'm the problem?" Poole coughed. "I'm warning you, leave town or face charges." Silas turned to Nita. She was shaking, not from fear, but fury, grief, shame all twisting together. She looked up at him, eyes glassy. "Please," she whispered, "go. I won't let you drown trying to save me." Silas stared at her, at the weight she'd carried, at the way she still stood tall. He wanted to fight. God help him, he wanted to tear this town apart. But she'd asked him to go. So he did. That night, he rode away from the cabin he'd half built with his bare hands. Behind him, the lantern in the window flickered once. Then darkness. The next morning, the cabin was quiet. Too quiet. Nita stood at the doorway, arms wrapped tight across her chest, watching the spot where Silas had disappeared into the dark. The frost hadn't yet melted off the grass. The swing he'd built for Cody hung still, one rope twisted like a question that hadn't been answered. Inside, the boys were silent. Not from confusion, but knowing. Caleb sat near the hearth, knife in hand, slowly carving on a stick, his jaw tight. Levi poked at the ashes, stirring them without purpose. Cody sat on the floor holding the little wooden horse Silas had carved, turning it over in his hands like it might suddenly bring him back. No one cried. Not out loud. By afternoon, word had spread. Nita went into town with eggs again. Nothing but barter left. This time even the shopkeeper wouldn't look her in the eye. She passed a pair of women by the post office, hats tilted, voices sweet but sharp. "I always said she was fast. No decent man'd stay long." Mitch left her. Silas, too. Some women just can't hold on to a man. Nita didn't flinch. Not anymore. But her hands shook when she set the eggs down. And when she turned, 3 more of Thorne's men waited across the street. Didn't say a word. Just stared. That night, she didn't sleep. Just sat by the window, shotgun across her lap, watching the ridge. The fire burned low. The boys snored quietly. But she knew. They'd be back. Silas didn't go far. Not really. He took work on a cattle ranch 40 miles north, mending fences and breaking frost with a dull axe. It was honest work. The kind that tired your body enough to keep the ghosts at bay, if only for a while. But the ghosts came anyway. He'd see Caleb's eyes in the firelight, how they watched and waited, not for words but proof. He'd hear Levi's questions about the stars. Cody's laugh, high and wild, echoing in his chest like it didn't belong there anymore. And Nita. He saw her most of all. The way she never begged, never broke. Not even when they tried to bury her under shame. Silas told himself he'd left to protect her, that he was saving her from the damage he carried like a second skin. But all it felt like now was failure dressed up like sacrifice. 2 weeks passed. Back at the cabin, spring hadn't arrived, but trouble had. Thorne's men rode up again. This time, no smiles. "You got 3 days," the lead one said, spitting in the dirt. "Then we come through here and wipe it clean, with or without you still on it." Nita said nothing, just stared at them until they turned their horses and rode off. That night, she finally cried. Not loud, not for long. But Caleb heard her. He stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching the only person in his life who never quit. Break. "We don't need a man who leaves," he muttered to Levi, who said nothing. Cody, ever hopeful, asked, "Is Pa coming back?" Nita couldn't answer. Maybe they didn't deserve someone who stayed. Maybe staying wasn't something men like Silas knew how to do. Then came the news. Silas was loading a wagon when a cowhand named Slim rode into camp. "Coldwater's buzzin'," he said, hopping down. "Thorne's sending boys up to burn that Apache woman's place. Says she abandoned it. Tomorrow night." The words hit Silas like a horse kick to the chest. Time stopped. Then it started again. Fast. He didn't speak, just saddled his horse and rode into the wind. Before he left, he stopped at the only grave he ever visited. A wooden cross marked Abigail stood crooked on a lonely hill. "I couldn't save you," he said aloud. "I'll never stop missing you. But those boys, that woman, they need me, and I need—" His voice cracked. "I need to live again." The wind blew, cold and honest. He touched the cross once, then mounted up, and rode like a man not running from his past anymore, but straight into it. The snow hadn't fully melted yet, but the world was thawing fast. Silas rode like a man with fire in his lungs. The wind tore past his face, biting hard, but he didn't feel it. All he heard was Slim's voice ringing in his skull. "They're burning her place tomorrow night." He hadn't asked for more, didn't need names or numbers, just the truth. And that was enough to light something in him that hadn't burned since Abigail's funeral. He made one stop. A ridge overlooking a river bend, Abigail and Rose's grave. The cross he'd carved still stood, weather-worn and leaning. Silas dismounted, dropped to one knee, and let his hand rest on the wood. "I never asked if I had the right," he said, "to live again, to try again." The wind whispered through the grass. "But if I don't go now, I'll never deserve peace. Not from you, not from her." He stood, then rode. And he rode hard. The sun was just bleeding into the tree line when Nita saw the torches. 4 riders. Slow, deliberate, like they weren't worried about who saw. She was outside chopping kindling. Caleb spotted them first and burst through the half-hung cabin door. "Ma," he said, breathless. "They're here." Levi pulled Cody behind him. Nita didn't run. She didn't panic. She turned, hands clenched tight. Then she whispered, "Into the woods. All of you. Now." "But what about—" Caleb started. "Now," she snapped, and there was no room for argument. The boys ran. She stayed. She watched as Elias Thorne and his hired men rode up to the ridge like it already belonged to them. The lead one flicked a match against his boot. That's when she saw the fire catch in the torch. And that's when she thought, this is how it ends. But then, the sound. Hoofbeats, fast, angry, cutting through snow and silence like a gunshot. From the trees, from the storm, from nowhere. He came. Silas. Coat flapping behind him, jaw set like stone. He looked like hell, and he looked like heaven. He didn't shout. He didn't slow. He just rode straight between the flames and the cabin, placing his horse between Nita's life and the men trying to erase it. Thorne raised a hand. "Well now," he said. "Look who found his spine." Silas dismounted. Calm. Purposeful. He stood tall, dusted with frost, eyes locked on the man who'd tried to make ruin seem like business. "That's far enough," Silas said. Thorne smirked. "You got no claim here." "You're wrong," Silas said. "This land belongs to the woman you tried to destroy, those boys you tried to intimidate, and me, the man who's done running." One of the hired guns stepped forward, hand twitching toward his holster. "Bad move." Silas moved faster than breath, disarmed the man in a blink, sent the gun skidding across the snow. The other men didn't draw. They were hired muscle, not martyrs. Thorn's smugness cracked just a little. "You think you've won something?" he hissed. "You think words matter out here?" "I didn't come with just words," Silas said. "I sent for witnesses." As if on cue, hoofbeats echoed behind him. Over the rise came 6 riders, ranchers from across the territory, weathered men, landmen, the kind who'd had enough of Thorn's tactics. Behind them trailed Sheriff Poole, hat in hand, eyes darting like a squirrel under a hawk's shadow. "Time to do your job, Sheriff," Silas said, "or step aside." Poole looked at Thorn, then at the men flanking him. He saw the tide had turned. Thorn paled. The ranchers dismounted, fanned out, arms crossed. Silas stepped closer. "This land is hers. These boys are under my protection. You touch 'em again, you answer to me." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to, because the fire was already burning in his chest, the kind that doesn't just survive the winter, but outlasts it. Then, from the trees, a shape emerged. Nita, the boys beside her. She saw Silas, saw what he'd done. He took off his hat. "I'm sorry I left," he said. "I thought I was protecting you. Truth is, leavin' was the real failure." His voice cracked. "But I ain't leavin' again." He looked at Caleb, then Levi, then Cody. "It ain't a promise, it's a vow." Cody broke first. He ran across the snow and threw himself into Silas's arms. Levi followed. Then, after a long pause, even Caleb came forward, eyes wet but shoulders straight. Finally, Nita walked to him, and she didn't say a word, just leaned into the man who came back, the man who stayed. The first warm wind of spring came late that year. It blew through the Pecos Basin like a breath the land had been holding too long, soft but sure. Snow melted into muddy trails, rivers rose with fresh purpose, and the cottonwoods began to bud green at last. Out at the edge of that wild, stubborn earth, the cabin stood still. But it was no longer the same. The porch had been rebuilt, sturdy and square. The fence stood straighter than before. Smoke curled from the chimney like a signal. We're still here. And in the field beyond, Silas and the boys walked the rows, shoulders bent, hands dirt-streaked, hearts healing. They planted not because the world was safe, but because it was theirs. Nita stood inside the cabin, staring at a small, carved box resting on the table. It was old, made from juniper wood. Her father had kept his arrowheads in it, her mother, her herbs. Inside now, 3 things: a hawk feather, worn smooth, the deerskin bracelet Caleb had made her, and a folded paper, creased, stained, but never opened since the day it came. Silas had written it before he left, a letter he never gave her. She unfolded it now, hands steady. "Nita, if you're reading this, I probably didn't come back. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For leaving. For all of it. I was afraid. Of failing again. Of loving again. But the truth is, I already loved you. Not because you needed saving, but because you never asked me to be anything I wasn't. If there's a next life, I hope I get to find you sooner. But if there's still time in this one, I'll fight for it." She smiled and wept. Both, then burned the letter in the stove, watching it curl to smoke and vanish. No ghosts left now, only the living. That evening, they gathered outside. A long table set under the cottonwood. Emma Carter brought cornbread. Old Man Barker brought fiddle music. Pastor Turner said grace, short and plain, like always. Neighbors sat beside neighbors, Apache beside Cowboy. No talk of bloodlines or brands, just stew, laughter, and the clink of tin cups. And Silas. He sat at the end of the table, not at the head, because he wasn't leading. He was with them. At last. Later, after dishes were cleaned and fireflies danced over the wheat, Silas walked out back alone. The barn door creaked as he leaned against it, hat in hand. Nita found him there. "You still think you're not the praying kind?" she asked softly. He smiled without looking. "Don't gotta kneel to know what matters." She stepped closer. "And what matters, Silas Boone?" He turned, looked her full in the eye. "You," he said. "These boys. This land." He paused. "And maybe forgiving yourself ain't about being worthy. Just about choosing to stay, no matter what hell tried to chase you off." She took his hand. "Then stay." He didn't answer. He just kissed her. Slow and quiet, and without apology. They buried the past with the plow, planted beans, corn, and something harder to grow. Hope. The boys worked harder than ever, but laughed more, too. Caleb took over fixing the fence line, talked less, but watched more. Levi started carving again, built a wind chime that never stopped ringing. And Cody, that wild colt of a boy, declared one morning he was going to be a preacher and a bronco rider. At the same time, Nita just smiled. Let the world decide what it thought. She already knew what mattered. And Silas? Some days he still walked out to the edge of the ridge, where the past liked to whisper. But now, he looked forward more than back. One morning, Nita found him hammering a post into the earth by the field. "What's that for?" she asked. He nodded to the rough wooden sign he'd carved. It said only 2 words. The Claim. Not a ranch name, not a warning, just the truth. They had staked their lives on one another, and that was worth more than land or gold. Epilogue. 1 year later. The cottonwood was taller now. So were the boys. The porch creaked under weight it hadn't seen in a while, a small gathering of travelers seeking rest and fire. Silas opened the door, face grayer but eyes lighter. Nita stood behind him, her hands still strong. They welcomed strangers like family, because once someone had given them a second chance. And every now and then, someone still asks, "Is it true what they say? That a cowboy once bought back a woman's soul for $2 and stayed to build her a kingdom?" No one answers outright. But if you sit long enough by the fire, someone might whisper, "He didn't buy her soul, he earned it." The end. What would you risk to claim a life worth living? And once you've found it, what would you do to stay? Would you choose to stay? Is this conversation helpful so far?